The year is 878. King Alfred of Wessex crouches in the marshes of Athelney, his kingdom in ruins, his army scattered, his people enslaved or dead. For 13 years, Viking armies have carved through England like a blade through parchment. 3 of the 4 great Anglo-Saxon kingdoms have fallen. York burns under foreign rule. The bones of King Edmund lie unburied after his ritual execution. Mercia bends the knee to Danish overlords. Now Wessex itself teeters on the edge of extinction. In a few short months, Alfred will either reclaim his birthright or England will cease to exist as a Christian nation. The next winter will determine whether English civilization survives or vanishes beneath the raven banners of the great heathen army. This is the story of how England died and was reborn, how the most devastating invasion in English history transformed defeat into the foundation of a unified kingdom, how survival against impossible odds created the strongest realm in medieval Europe. The first ships appeared off the coast of East Anglia in 865. Not the usual raiding parties that had terrorized monasteries for decades, but something far more dangerous. The great heathen army had come not to plunder and retreat, but to conquer and settle. Led by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, this was no mere Viking raid. It was a coordinated invasion force designed to carve kingdoms from English soil. Ivar the Boneless commanded the largest Viking army ever assembled against England. Contemporary sources speak of hundreds of ships carrying thousands of warriors. These weren't desperate raiders seeking quick wealth. They were professional soldiers equipped for sustained warfare, supported by siege engines and cavalry units. The army that landed in East Anglia represented the military might of Denmark, Norway, and the Swedish kingdoms united under a single banner. The Anglo-Saxon response revealed the fatal weakness that would nearly destroy England. 4 separate kingdoms faced the invasion independently. Northumbria, East Anglia, Mercia, and Wessex had spent generations warring against each other. Ancient rivalries ran deeper than the immediate threat. When the Vikings struck, no unified defense existed. No coordinated strategy emerged. Each kingdom fought alone, while their neighbours calculated whether Viking victory might serve their own political interests. East Anglia fell first, not through military defeat, but through accommodation. King Edmund initially provided the Vikings with horses and supplies, hoping to buy them off as previous English kings had done with earlier raiding parties. But Ivar had not crossed the North Sea to collect tribute. He had come to stay. The kingdom that welcomed the great heathen army as temporary guests found itself under permanent occupation within months. The following year brought systematic destruction. The Vikings moved north into Northumbria, where they found a kingdom already weakened by civil war. 2 rival claimants, Osbert and Ella, had been fighting for the crown when the invasion began. The brothers finally united their forces to face the foreign threat, but unity came too late. At York in 867, the combined Northumbrian army met the Vikings in what should have been a decisive battle for the kingdom's survival. The slaughter was complete. Both Northumbrian kings died, along with most of their nobility. York, the great northern capital that had stood since Roman times, opened its gates to Viking occupation. The largest and most powerful of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms simply ceased to exist as an independent political entity. Where once Northumbrian kings had ruled from the Scottish borders to the Humber, Danish jarls now divided the land among themselves. The psychological impact of Northumbria's collapse rippled across England. If the mightiest kingdom could fall in a single afternoon, what hope did the others have? The Vikings had not just won a battle. They had demonstrated that Anglo-Saxon military power was an illusion. Centuries of political development, Christian culture, and territorial expansion crumbled before an enemy that understood warfare in ways the English had forgotten. Mercia's agony began in 868. King Burgred, who had ruled the Midland Kingdom for over 20 years, found his realm invaded by forces he could not comprehend or contain. The Vikings employed tactics that defied traditional Anglo-Saxon military thinking. Instead of seeking pitched battles, they fortified strategic positions and forced the English to attack prepared defences. When Mercian armies advanced, Viking cavalry struck their flanks. When the English retreated, mounted archers harassed their withdrawal. The campaign that destroyed Mercia lasted 5 years. Not a quick conquest, but a methodical dismantling of royal authority. Viking armies wintered in Mercian territories, living off the land while their enemies struggled to maintain forces in the field. English kings could not sustain armies indefinitely. Their warriors needed to return to their farms and estates. The Vikings had no such constraints. Professional soldiers with no other occupation, they could campaign year-round while their enemies exhausted themselves. By 873, Burgred's resistance had become futile. The king who had once commanded the most prosperous realm in England fled to Rome, abandoning his people to foreign rule. The Vikings installed Ceolwulf as a puppet ruler, but real power lay with Danish commanders who divided Mercia's wealth among themselves. Another ancient kingdom had joined Northumbria in political extinction. The fate of King Edmund of East Anglia became the symbol of Viking ruthlessness. Contemporary chronicles describe his capture and execution in terms that reveal the depth of English trauma. Edmund refused to renounce his Christian faith or share power with pagan conquerors. The Vikings responded with calculated brutality designed to break English morale. They tied Edmund to a tree and used him for archery practice, filling his body with arrows before finally beheading him. Edmund's death was not random violence, but psychological warfare. The Vikings understood that killing a king was not enough. They had to destroy the idea of kingship itself. By executing Edmund in the manner of a sacrificial ritual, they demonstrated that Christian monarchy offered no protection against pagan power. The message reached every corner of England. Your kings cannot save you. Your God will not intervene. Submit or die. The systematic destruction of Anglo-Saxon political authority created a refugee crisis that contemporaries compared to biblical disasters. Nobles fled to continental Europe. Monks abandoned monasteries that had stood for centuries. Entire populations migrated south, seeking protection in Wessex, the last independent English kingdom. The cultural damage was incalculable. Libraries burned, schools closed. The intellectual achievements of the Northumbrian Renaissance vanished under Danish occupation, yet the material destruction was equally devastating. The Vikings were not interested in preserving the economic systems they conquered. They wanted immediate wealth, not long-term productivity. Estates that had supported complex agricultural communities were stripped of their assets. Trade networks that had connected English markets to continental Europe collapsed when their urban centres fell under foreign control. The wealth that had made Anglo-Saxon England a European power flowed across the North Sea to Scandinavian kingdoms. By 875, 3/4 of England lay under Danish rule. The political geography that had defined English civilization for 3 centuries no longer existed. In place of the ancient kingdoms stood a collection of Viking territories governed by foreign warriors who owed no allegiance to English law or Christian authority. The conquest was so complete that contemporary sources struggled to find adequate terms for what had occurred. This was not military defeat, it was civilizational collapse. Only Wessex remained, and Wessex was failing. King Alfred, who had inherited the throne in 871, fought battle after battle against overwhelming odds. His victories were temporary respites in a war he was slowly losing. Viking armies could replace their losses from reserves in Denmark and Norway. Alfred's forces grew smaller with each campaign as his kingdom's population declined and his resources were exhausted. The winter of 878 brought the final crisis. A surprise Viking attack forced Alfred to flee his capital at Chippenham. The last Anglo-Saxon king became a fugitive in his own realm, hiding in the Somerset marshes with a handful of loyal followers. Contemporary chronicles describe a moment when English independence hung by the thinnest thread imaginable. If Alfred died in those marshes, if his small band of survivors was discovered and destroyed, England as an independent Christian nation would cease to exist. Nation would cease to exist. The marshes of Athelney became the crucible where English resistance was either forged or extinguished forever. Alfred's refuge was no fortress, but a collection of scattered islands in the Somerset wetlands, where a king reduced to the status of an outlaw planned what seemed like an impossible resurrection. The handful of Thens who remained loyal represented all that survived of legitimate Anglo-Saxon authority. Their weapons were tarnished, their mail broken, their horses lost to Viking raiders who controlled every road and settlement beyond the marsh boundaries. Yet in this moment of absolute desolation, Alfred began the transformation that would reshape English warfare forever. The traditional Anglo-Saxon military system had failed catastrophically. Kings had summoned their fyrd, the militia of free farmers, for brief campaigns before warriors returned to their fields. The Vikings faced no such limitations. Their professional armies could campaign indefinitely, wearing down English resistance through sheer persistence. Alfred understood that matching Viking mobility and endurance required abandoning centuries of military tradition. The first innovation emerged from desperation. Small bands of mounted warriors began striking Viking supply lines and isolated garrisons. These were not the formal cavalry charges of continental warfare, but hit-and-run attacks that exploited local knowledge of terrain. Alfred's men knew every path through the Somerset levels, every ford across the rivers, every refuge where they could disappear when Viking pursuit became too intense. What began as survival tactics evolved into a systematic guerrilla campaign that slowly eroded Viking confidence. Spring brought the first test of Alfred's new methods. Intelligence reached the marsh hideouts that Guthrum was moving his main army toward the heart of Wessex, confident that the last pocket of English resistance could be eliminated before the campaigning season ended. Alfred faced a decision that would determine England's future. Remain hidden in the marshes and preserve his small force, or emerge to fight a battle that could destroy the last hope of English independence. The choice revealed Alfred's strategic genius. He sent messages throughout Wessex calling for a general levy, but not the traditional summons that had failed so often before. This time, the king specified meeting points and coordination methods that reflected hard-learned lessons about Viking tactics. The English army that assembled at Egbert's Stone in May 878 was different from any that had faced the invaders previously. The men who answered Alfred's call had endured 7 years of occupation, taxation, and humiliation under foreign rule. They came not as reluctant farmers fulfilling feudal obligations, but as desperate men fighting for the survival of everything they valued. More importantly, they came with new equipment and training. Alfred had used his months in exile to develop innovations that addressed the fundamental weaknesses that had destroyed the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The march to Edington demonstrated the transformation of English military capability. Alfred's army moved with a discipline and coordination that surprised the Vikings, who had grown accustomed to defeating scattered and poorly led English forces. Scout networks provided intelligence about enemy movements. Supply trains followed predetermined routes. Most crucially, the army maintained formation and morale despite the psychological pressure of facing warriors who had seemed invincible for over a decade. The battle itself unfolded as a collision between two completely different military philosophies. Guthrum deployed his forces according to Viking tactical doctrine that had proven successful across Europe. Shield walls anchored by veteran warriors, supported by mobile reserves that could exploit any weakness in enemy formations. The Danish army that took position on the slopes above Edington represented the finest military machine of its age, commanded by a general who had never lost a major engagement. Alfred's response revealed how profoundly English warfare had evolved under the pressure of near extinction. The West Saxon army advanced in a formation that borrowed elements from both traditional Anglo-Saxon tactics and innovations developed during the guerrilla campaign. Dense infantry formations provided stability, but they were supported by mounted units trained in the harassment techniques that had proven effective in the Somerset marshes. The fighting began with the clash of shield walls that had characterized Anglo-Saxon warfare for generations. But as the battle developed, Alfred introduced tactical elements that caught the Vikings completely off guard. English reserves struck the Danish flanks at precisely coordinated moments. Mounted archers appeared where Guthrum expected only infantry. Most devastating of all, Alfred had learned to sustain offensive pressure beyond the brief initial charge that typically decided medieval battles. The psychological transformation was as significant as the tactical innovation. The English army that fought at Edington was no longer the collection of reluctant farmers that had been defeated repeatedly over the previous decade. These were men who had seen their kingdoms destroyed, their families enslaved, their culture suppressed. They fought with the desperate fury of people who understood that defeat meant not just political subjugation, but cultural extinction. Guthrum's army broke after hours of combat that defied every precedent in Viking experience. The Danish warriors who had conquered kingdoms fled in panic from an enemy they had dismissed as defeated. The pursuit that followed completed the reversal of fortune that had seemed impossible just months earlier. Vikings, who had terrorized England for 13 years, found themselves hunted through their own conquered territories by English forces that had learned to fight with Viking efficiency and English determination. The siege of Guthrum's fortress at Chippenham demonstrated how completely the strategic situation had reversed. The Viking army that had driven Alfred into exile now found itself trapped and besieged by forces it could neither defeat nor escape. After 14 days without supplies, the conquerors of England were reduced to begging for terms from the king they had thought destroyed. The Treaty of Wedmore that ended the siege established principles that would reshape the political geography of Britain. Guthrum agreed to withdraw from Wessex and accept baptism as a Christian. More significantly, the treaty recognized a formal division of England between English and Danish territories. The Danelaw, as it came to be known, acknowledged Viking control over conquered lands while establishing clear boundaries that neither side would cross without consequence. Yet Alfred understood that military victory was meaningless without the institutional reforms necessary to prevent future conquest. The king who emerged from the Somerset marshes was not content to restore the political arrangements that had failed so catastrophically. Instead, he began implementing a comprehensive transformation of English society designed to create permanent advantages over any future invaders, aiders. The treaty signed at Wedmore represented more than a temporary cessation of hostilities. Alfred had purchased breathing space with his victory, but he understood that peace with the Vikings was merely an opportunity to prepare for the next inevitable conflict. The Danish territories that stretched from Northumbria to East Anglia remained under foreign control, their populations governed by jarls who owed no allegiance to English law. Guthrum's conversion to Christianity was a diplomatic gesture that changed nothing fundamental about Viking ambitions or capabilities. Alfred's genius lay in recognizing that survival required transformation, not restoration. The political and military systems that had governed Anglo-Saxon England for centuries had proven inadequate against sustained foreign pressure. Rather than attempting to rebuild what had failed, the king began constructing entirely new institutions designed specifically to counter Viking advantages. The next decade would witness the most comprehensive military and administrative revolution in English history. The foundation of Alfred's new system was the Burh network, a chain of fortified towns strategically positioned to control key rivers, roads, and agricultural regions throughout Wessex. These were not traditional Anglo-Saxon settlements, but planned communities designed according to military principles that reflected hard-learned lessons about Viking warfare. Each burh was positioned no more than 20 miles from its neighbours, ensuring that no part of the kingdom lay beyond the protection of fortified walls. The construction of these fortifications required mobilizing resources on a scale unprecedented in Anglo-Saxon England. Thousands of workers quarried stone, felled timber, and excavated earthworks under the direction of engineers who combined traditional English building techniques with innovations borrowed from continental European fortress design. The Burgel Heidage, a document that survives from Alfred's reign, reveals the mathematical precision behind this undertaking. Each burh was assigned a specific number of hides of land to support its garrison and maintenance, creating a sustainable defensive network that could operate indefinitely without exhausting royal resources. But the burhs represented more than military installations. They became centers of economic activity that gradually shifted the balance of wealth and population away from the scattered rural estates that had characterized Anglo-Saxon society. Craftsmen, merchants, and farmers were encouraged to settle within the fortified walls, where they could pursue their occupations under royal protection. Markets developed around the security these towns provided, creating new sources of revenue that funded further military improvements. The transformation of English military organization proceeded alongside fortress construction. Alfred abandoned the traditional fyrd system that had summoned farmers for brief military service before returning to their fields. Instead, he implemented a rotation system that divided the kingdom's military obligations between two groups. Half of the available warriors served in the field at any given time, while the other half remained at home to maintain agricultural production and local defense. This innovation solved the fundamental problem that had crippled previous English responses to Viking invasions. The new system required developing professional military capabilities that matched Viking standards. Alfred established training programs that taught English warriors the mounted warfare techniques that had proven so effective during the guerrilla campaign in Somerset. Archery schools produced marksmen capable of the accurate long-range shooting that characterized Viking tactics. Most importantly, the king created a cadre of professional officers who could maintain discipline and coordination during extended campaigns. Naval warfare received equal attention in Alfred's military revolution. The Vikings had dominated English waters for decades, using their maritime superiority to strike wherever coastal defences were weakest. Alfred commissioned the construction of a royal fleet designed specifically to counter Scandinavian naval advantages. These ships were longer and faster than traditional Viking vessels, crewed by sailors trained in the aggressive tactics that had made Danish fleets so feared throughout Europe. The first test of Alfred's innovations came in 885 when a new Viking army landed in Kent. This force represented a different threat from Guthrum's great Heathen army. Rather than seeking conquest and settlement, these raiders intended to exploit the wealth that Wessex had accumulated during the years of peace. They expected to face the same poorly organized resistance that had collapsed so easily in the previous decade. Instead, they encountered a military machine that had been specifically designed to counter their advantages. The campaign that followed demonstrated how completely English defensive capabilities had been transformed. Viking forces that attempted to penetrate inland found their progress blocked by Boer garrisons that could not be bypassed or ignored. When they besieged these fortifications, relief armies appeared with a speed and coordination that had been impossible under the old system. Most critically, the English fleet intercepted Danish supply ships and reinforcements, isolating the invaders in hostile territory where they could neither advance nor retreat safely. The Viking withdrawal from Kent marked a fundamental shift in the balance of power between English and Scandinavian forces. For the first time since the initial invasions, foreign armies had been forced to abandon English territory without achieving their objectives. The psychological impact extended far beyond military considerations. English populations that had lived under the shadow of Viking terror for 2 decades began to believe that effective resistance was possible. Alfred's domestic reforms complemented his military innovations by strengthening the economic and administrative foundations of royal power. The king implemented a comprehensive legal code that unified the diverse traditions of the various tribes and regions that comprise Wessex. This law code established consistent standards for justice, taxation, and military service that applied throughout the kingdom, regardless of local customs or political arrangements that had previously varied from district to district. Education received unprecedented royal attention as Alfred recognized that long-term security required cultural as well as military strength. The king personally sponsored the translation of essential Latin texts into English, making knowledge previously restricted to clerical elites available to lay administrators and military leaders. Schools were established in major towns to train the literate officials necessary for governing the expanded territories that successful military campaigns would eventually recover. The transformation of English society under Alfred's guidance created capabilities that extended far beyond mere defense against Viking raids. The kingdom that emerged from this period of reform possessed the institutional strength to support sustained offensive operations against Danish territories. More importantly, it had developed the administrative sophistication necessary to govern conquered populations and integrate them into a unified political system. This foundation would prove essential as Alfred's successors began the systematic reconquest of Viking-held territories. The innovations implemented during the desperate years following Edington created the tools that would eventually restore English authority over the entire island. The king, who had hidden in the Somerset marshes, had not merely saved Wessex from destruction. He had forged the instruments that would transform England from a collection of vulnerable kingdoms into the most powerful unified realm in medieval Europe. The stage was set for the next phase of English recovery, a methodical campaign of expansion that would gradually reclaim the ancient kingdoms from their Danish occupiers. But this reconquest would succeed only because Alfred had learned the fundamental lesson that Edington taught. Victory required not just defeating enemies, but building systems that could sustain success across generations. The institutions created in Wessex during the 880s would guide English expansion for the next century, until the last Viking stronghold had fallen and England stood united under a single crown. The death of Alfred in 899 marked not an ending, but a transformation. The king who had saved England from extinction left behind more than restored territories and military innovations. He had created a dynasty with the vision and capability to complete what his generation had begun. His son Edward inherited not just a crown, but a comprehensive strategy for reclaiming the ancient kingdoms that lay under Danish rule. Edward the Elder possessed advantages his father had never enjoyed. The Burr system provided secure bases for offensive operations. The reorganized army could sustain campaigns far from Wessex without compromising homeland defense. Most crucially, the administrative machinery Alfred had constructed could absorb and govern conquered territories, rather than simply raiding them. The tools for systematic reconquest were ready. The question was whether Edward possessed the strategic patience to use them effectively. The new king's first campaigns revealed a methodical approach that reflected his father's influence. Rather than attempting to liberate entire kingdoms through dramatic victories, Edward focused on extending West Saxon control incrementally. Each advance was consolidated through fortress construction and administrative integration before the next phase began. The burhs that had defended Wessex became staging areas for expansion into Mercia and East Anglia. Edward's strategy succeeded because it addressed the fundamental problem that had plagued earlier English resistance to Viking occupation. Previous attempts to reclaim conquered territories had relied on temporary military victories that left political control unchanged. Danish jarls who submitted to English kings after battlefield defeats retained their local authority and could rebel whenever circumstances favoured renewed independence. Edward instead replaced Viking administration entirely, installing English officials who owed their positions to West Saxon patronage. The reconquest of London in 911 demonstrated how completely the strategic situation had reversed since Alfred's desperate years in the Somerset marshes. The great trading city that had fallen to Danish control decades earlier was now besieged by English forces equipped with siege engines and naval support that matched anything the Vikings could deploy. More significantly, the population that had endured foreign occupation welcomed English liberation rather than resisting it as another conquest. The systematic nature of Edward's advance became apparent as campaign followed campaign with relentless precision. Each captured stronghold was immediately fortified according to Burr specifications. English colonists were settled in strategic locations to ensure loyal populations in recovered territories. Danish nobles who accepted English authority retained their estates, while those who resisted found themselves replaced by West Saxon appointees who understood that their continued prosperity depended on maintaining royal favour. Yet the reconquest faced challenges that pure military success could not overcome. Generations of Danish settlement had created complex ethnic and cultural divisions that threatened to fragment any unified political system. The Danelaw had developed its own legal traditions, economic networks, and social hierarchies that differed fundamentally from West Saxon arrangements. Imposing uniform administration risked provoking rebellions that could undo military gains faster than they had been achieved. Edward's solution revealed the sophistication of the political system his father had created. Rather than forcing immediate cultural assimilation, the king allowed Danish communities to retain many of their traditional practices while gradually introducing English legal and administrative frameworks. This approach minimized resistance while ensuring that real political authority remained in West Saxon hands. The result was a form of indirect rule that preserved local stability while advancing strategic objectives. The partnership between Edward and his sister Ethelfled elevated English capabilities beyond what either could have achieved independently. As Lady of the Mercians, Ethelfled commanded resources and territory that effectively doubled the forces available for anti-Danish campaigns. More importantly, her rule provided political legitimacy for English expansion into Mercia that would have been difficult to establish through conquest alone. The Restoration appeared to be led by Mercian authority rather than imposed by foreign domination. Ethelfled's military accomplishments matched her political significance. The fortifications she constructed along the Welsh border and in recovered Mercian territories demonstrated engineering skills that rivaled her brother's achievements. Her campaigns against Viking strongholds in the north revealed tactical innovations that combined traditional Anglo-Saxon methods with techniques adapted from continental European warfare. The Lady of the Mercians was not merely Edward's ally, but an independent military leader whose contributions were essential to overall success. The coordinated campaigns of 917 and 918 marked the climax of the systematic reconquest that had proceeded for nearly 2 decades. English forces, advancing from multiple directions, overwhelmed Danish defences that had been designed to resist attacks from single directions. The fall of Derby, Leicester, and Nottingham within months of each other demonstrated that Viking resistance was collapsing under sustained pressure from enemies who had learned to fight with unprecedented coordination and persistence. The submission of York in 918 represented the symbolic completion of Edward's reconquest strategy. The great northern capital that had fallen to Viking occupation 50 years earlier opened its gates to English authority without resistance. The Danish Jarls who had ruled Northumbria since the destruction of the original Anglo-Saxon kingdom acknowledged West Saxon overlordship rather than face the systematic siege warfare that had proven unstoppable throughout the Midlands. Yet the political integration of recovered territories required innovations that extended far beyond military administration. The diverse populations that comprised the expanded English kingdom included not only Anglo-Saxons and Danes, but Welsh communities, Norse settlers, and various tribal groups that had maintained semi-independent status throughout the period of Viking domination. Creating unified institutions that could govern this ethnic complexity demanded administrative skills that surpassed anything previously attempted in medieval Europe. Edward's legal reforms addressed this challenge through a comprehensive code that recognized local variations while establishing consistent standards for major crimes and commercial disputes. Danish communities retained their traditional courts for minor matters, while serious offences were judged according to English law. This system preserved cultural autonomy while ensuring that royal authority could not be challenged through appeals to separate legal traditions. The economic integration of conquered territories proceeded through market regulations that encouraged trade while preventing the commercial networks that had supported Viking political independence. English coinage replaced Danish currencies, creating uniform standards that facilitated commerce while reinforcing political unity. The burhs that had been constructed for military purposes evolved into commercial centres that gradually shifted economic activity away from the scattered rural settlements that had characterised pre-conquest society. The death of Ethelfled in 918 created a succession crisis that tested whether the political system constructed over 2 decades could survive the loss of key leadership. Edward's annexation of Mercia following his sister's death risked provoking the regional rebellions that had destroyed previous attempts to unify the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Instead, the transition proceeded smoothly because the administrative machinery they had created together operated independently of personal loyalties or dynastic arrangements. The final phase of Edward's reign witnessed the consolidation of achievements that had seemed impossible when Alfred fled into the Somerset marshes. The kingdom that stretched from Cornwall to the Scottish border represented not merely the restoration of pre-Viking political arrangements, but the creation of something entirely new. England had become a unified state with the institutional capacity to govern diverse populations across vast territories while maintaining the military strength to defend against any conceivable external threat. Edward's death in 924 transferred power to his son Athelstan, who inherited not just territories, but the momentum of systematic expansion that his predecessors had initiated. The new king faced the final challenge of the reconquest period. While English authority now extended throughout most of the former Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, pockets of independent Viking rule persisted in the far north, where geographic isolation provided natural defences against the siege warfare that had proven so effective elsewhere. The campaigns that would complete the reconquest required adapting English military methods to terrain and enemies that differed significantly from the Midland settlements that had been recovered during Edward's reign. The final Viking strongholds were defended by warriors who understood that surrender meant not integration into English society, but exile from the only homes they had ever known. The battles ahead would determine whether the unified England that Alfred had envisioned could finally become reality. Reality. The year 954 marked the end of an extraordinary transformation. Eric Bloodaxe, the last Viking king of York, fell in battle at Stainmore, his death extinguishing the final flame of independent Scandinavian rule in England. What had begun with Alfred's desperate flight into the Somerset marshes concluded with Edred's complete sovereignty over territories that stretched from the Channel to the Scottish borders. The fragmented kingdoms that had crumbled before the great heathen army had been reforged into something unprecedented in European history. England stood unified, stronger than it had ever been, its survival having created the institutional foundations of medieval Europe's most formidable realm. The Vikings who came as conquerors had unwittingly forged the very unity that would define English civilization for centuries to come.